Huxley, we all think of you, as our host has said, as a writer of many parts today. But I've always felt that it was really as a novelist you should be thought of first. Would you agree?
Well, in a way I'd be very flattered, because I would certainly like to have written a very good novel. I don't think I ever have. And in a way, I think maybe it's slightly fraudulent, what my pretension is to be a novelist. Perhaps I really am an essayist who uses the novelistic form, but who enjoys it very much.
I remember how delighted we all were with those early novels of yours in the 20s. You seemed to us the most sophisticated of witty entertainers, a debunker bringing things down to earth with a bump, particularly sex. But even there, I felt, your desire to impart curious information and to discuss strange ideas was very much in evidence. Did you have the feeling that you wanted to teach then as well as to entertain?
Well, I think I always had a feeling that I wanted to learn, and maybe that this was the most effective way of learning, I think it is very often the fact of getting things down is the best way of clarifying one's own mind. Maybe I am a little bit pedantic, but this has always been my desire to learn, to explore.
And when later on shall we say, the teaching side in your novel seemed to grow stronger than the entertaining side, were you working out these new ideas of mysticism and the divine ground for yourself in these books?
Yes. My problem has always been, of course, to find, if possible, some kind of balance between the two sides. I don't think I've succeeded very well always. I think I have once or twice succeeded pretty well, not perhaps to my entire satisfaction, but...
You say in one of your essays that Balzac almost ruined himself as a novelist by trying to stuff everything into his novels, everything he knew and everything he thought about banking, science, politics, industry, mysticism. Were you conscious of this difficulty, this danger yourself?
Well, it's certainly a temptation to which I've been very much subject. It's a thing which I've always tried to do in my essays, so to speak, to say everything simultaneously, but not in a boring way. I think this is the greatest challenge, to be able to bring together into a harmonious whole an enormous number of elements, and yet to keep the unity.
So the fact that since the war most of your work has been non-fiction doesn't mean that you've lost your faith in the novel?
Not at all. I have written, quite recently I wrote a short novel, and I'm trying to write a rather longer fantasy now.
And you don't think that the novel as an art form is on the way out?
Well, a lot of people like to say so, but I cannot see any reason why this should be true. I think people will always go on using the narrative form, because it's the most extraordinary form. You can do anything you like with it. There are no rules except to do it well, and I think people will continually adapt the narrative form to the problems which confront them at the given moment of history.
Yes, but I remember that in a recent essay of yours, you do say that you thought serious novel writing was facing a very difficult future, and might have, in fact, to go onto gramophone records.
Well, this is an economic problem. There are obviously very, very serious economic problems with there is such a thing as what may be called an economic censorship as well as a political censorship. We have the economic censorship, and it's very grave. And I think possibly the spoken literature may be some way out for this.
It would be bound to change novels, wouldn't it, if they became spoken?
Well, profoundly. I don't think you could have a very long novel, but I think you could have shorter pieces which might go. I don't know. It is just a suggestion I made.
You don't think that perhaps other difficulties beside the economic are more serious today for the novelist?
Well, I think there is what may be called social difficulties. I was reading just the other day, as I was traveling through Sicily, reading Trollope's Framley Parsonage and thinking how wonderful it was for novelists in those happy days to have a completely rigid framework. Everybody knew exactly where they stood, and it was possible to make your comments from an accepted ground.
And that's quite gone today.
It seems to have quite gone today.
Do you think it's worse in America, that feeling, than it is here?
I think it's bad enough everywhere. Maybe it is worse in America. I think people have, partly because the country is so very large and conditions are so very different in different parts of it. There is a great confusion, so to speak, in who we are and what we are, which requires quite a different way of treatment from what it did in the past.
In California, do you feel California is a good place for a writer to be? Is it stimulating to him?
Well, I find it, because there are many things about the surroundings and the climate which happen to suit me very well. I mean, for example, I happen to like very much the desert, which is something which grows upon one as one gets to know it well.
I've heard people say that the desert and this air of California gives one an extraordinary sense of heightened perception.
Yes, the desert, of course, has this extraordinary quality of silence, which is quite unlike anything that I know about, and of course this immense clarity and the expanse of the sky is something very extraordinary.
In your book about mescaline recently, you talked of a state of heightened perception being induced, a valuable state of heightened perception, being induced by drugs, by proper drugs. Do you think imaginative writers would benefit by that?
Well, I think the people who would benefit most of all are professors. And this, I think it would be extremely good for almost anybody with fixed ideas and with a great certainty about what's what, to take this thing and to realize that the world he has constructed is by no means the only world, that there are these extraordinary other types of universe which we may inhabit and which we should be very grateful for inhabiting, I think.
Perhaps poets and novelists, or the greatest poets and novelists, have something in them that is like this.
Well, I'm quite sure they do. I mean, anybody who's read the Wordsmiths' Ode on the Intimations of Immortality and who's also taken lysergic acid, let's say, knows quite well that Wordsworth spontaneously had this, and quite clearly Blake had it too, and many others, I would say.
You do, of course, anticipate this world of tranquilizers and pep drugs and truth drugs in your novel Brave New World, to some extent.
Yes, I was, of course, there I projected these things 500 or 600 years into the future, and it is rather alarming to find that only 27 years later quite a number of these forecasts have already come true, and come true with a vengeance.
Are you going to write a postscript to Brave New World?
Well, I've written a few chapters on the things which have already come true, and in general on the menaces to individual liberty which seem to me to be in existence in the world today. I think there are very grave threats which, although they may not be acute, particularly in the democratic countries, are potentially very grave indeed.
And unforeseen by you in Brave New World?
Some of them were foreseen, and I think some of them I didn't have sufficient imagination to foresee, but I think there is a whole armory at the disposal of potential dictators at the moment, which is very alarming.
In drugs and in surgery?
And drugs and in surgery and in various types of mental manipulation. There's a great deal which can be done, and which I'm afraid, unless we're extremely vigilant, may be done.
Do you think that that can be mirrored in art? You say somewhere that you think that art and the novel can't really cope with some of these problems that face the world today.
Well, I think there are very great difficulties in putting certain problems into the form of art. I mean, take the fact, for example, that poetry has very seldom had anything very significant to say about money, which after all preoccupies most of us a great deal. but there's extremely little in great poetry about this problem. And I mean, for example, in our own day, it seems exceedingly difficult to render in artistic terms one of the great problems of our age, which is the problem of population pressures pressing upon resources.
Are you going to be writing some more novels?
Well, I'm trying to write one. I've just begun one at the moment.
Can we ask what its subject is?
Well, it's a fantasy. It's a kind of reverse Brave New World about a society in which serious efforts are made to develop the potentialities of individuals to the full. It's an extremely difficult thing to write, because it's much easier to write about negative things than about positive
This is an
things.
ideal picture.
It's an ideal, but I hope not a stratospheric ideal, what may be called a utopian rather than a utopian fantasy, a fantasy dealing with a place and real place and time, rather than a fantasy dealing with no place and no time.
Yes. Well, it sounds to me enormously interesting. I look forward to it very much. Thank you very much, Aldous Huxley.
Well, thank you, John Lehmann. It's been very nice talking to you.